Awaken Your Shadow. The truth sets some people free. It offends everyone else. By Seth, the Red Neo, Cherupak.
Chapter 6, Part 2, The Shadow of the Reckless Self.
The reckless self is the shadow of your adventurous self. It shares the same raw hunger for aliveness and expansion, but lacks the grounding and direction that make true adventure meaningful. This isn't exploration, it's escape. The adventurous self seeks new horizons with purpose and perseverance. The reckless self lunges toward novelty to avoid what might surface during stillness. Instead of moving from rooted courage, it runs on restless urgency. Adrenaline replaces curiosity. Activity becomes a shield against the discomfort of quiet or the vulnerability of reflection. This pattern often develops in environments where freedom was stifled or structure felt suffocating. Without the steady rhythm of security, movement becomes compulsive. Risk feels like oxygen. Rest feels suffocating. Stillness becomes threatening, not soothing. Physiologically, this doesn't simply mirror fight or flight in the stress sense, it's a state of chronic overactivation. Research on stress and reward pathways shows that repeated exposure to adrenaline and cortisol can condition the brain to crave these neurochemical surges. Sapolsky, 2004. Dopamine, tied to novelty and reward-seeking, reinforces this loop, creating what some neuroscientists call behavioral addiction to one's own stimulatory chemistry. Volkoff and Morales, 2015. In the midst of this addiction, the body equates urgency and chaos with aliveness or even freedom. Ancient wisdom tells us that the reckless self is within us all and has been for ages. The Bhagavad Gita 14:12 Eknath Easwaran translation says, "When rajas predominates, greed, activity, restlessness, longing arise, and the person is driven to action." The Tao Te Ching, chapter 12, Stephen Mitchell translation tells us, "Racing and hunting madden the mind. Precious things lead one astray." In Judges 16, Samson, New International Version, Samson's story illustrates how reckless pursuit of thrill and indulgence with Delilah ultimately stripped him of his strength and purpose. The Dhammapada, chapter 24, Thirst, verse 334, Acharya Buddharakkhita translation, says, "The craving of a person who lives negligently grows like a creeper. He jumps from life to life like a monkey seeking fruit in the forest." These texts collectively highlight how overstimulation, craving, and unchecked desire destabilize both mind and spirit. The reckless self expresses this same energy through modern archetypes driven by the same impulses warned of in the ancient writings. The social media junkie who is never fully present because they're too busy filming, taking, and posting selfies, documenting their experience instead of living in it. A tourist in their own life, promoting the life they want others to see them living while missing out on it themselves. The compulsive collector who fills online carts late at night, craving the dopamine hit of the purchase even though it leaves them emptier and anxious when the packages arrive. These are lived examples of how the reckless self hides its exhaustion behind a mask of movement. The adrenaline addict who jumps from one novel experience to another, chasing the rush of inner noise to escape the pain of mundanity and silence and the unease of what might arise if they sat still with their own thoughts. In small doses, These behaviors reflect a healthy enjoyment of life's little pleasures, which is part of our natural need for excitement. The problem comes when they make us restless and pull us out of the present in search of the next fix. These are examples of the reckless self hiding its deeper feelings of emptiness, loneliness, or futility behind the mask of movement. In this state, heart rate stays elevated, breath sharp and shallow, muscles primed to spring, sleep is light and restless, energy spikes and crashes. Pleasure is fleeting because it's chased, not cultivated. This is how the reckless self feeds on stimulation to avoid discomfort, mistaking motion for meaning and novelty for nourishment. This fracture doesn't come from our desire for excitement. It comes to fill the space created when we resist or flee structure, consequence, and stillness. Without foundation or direction, the reckless self starts many new ventures, but rarely, if ever, follows through with them. Motion becomes compulsive, purpose remains elusive, and change becomes the substitute for growth. Like a wanderer without a home, it never stops long enough to anchor, reflect, or integrate. This is not evolution, it's drift. And when you try to halt it by force, the psyche splits. One part rushes headlong into chaos, while another retreats entirely from risk. Neither is steady. Both are reactive. When you try to suppress either of these by force, the psyche splits, one part lunging headlong into chaos, the other retreating entirely from risk. Neither holds center. Both strain the nervous system like frayed rope pulled in opposite directions. It is here, stretched between compulsion and retreat, that the reckless self destabilizes. And from this unsteady center, it tilts toward two opposing distortions, each born of the same hunger, but carrying it in radically different forms. New subheader, Recklessness and the Dark Feminine by The first fracture of the reckless self emerges as the siren. The term siren comes from Greek myth, sea enchantresses whose irresistible songs lured sailors to wreck themselves on jagged rocks, temptation promising ecstasy but ending in ruin. Sharon Stone's Catherine Trammell, in Basic Instinct, modernized this archetype, alluring intelligence weaponized to destabilize and enthrall. Her power wasn't just sexuality, it was control cloaked in mystery and danger. The siren is the dark feminine shadow of your adventurous self. The siren is characterized by sensation without depth, movement without meaning, allure without anchor. Untethered from the stabilizing sacred masculine, she thrives in volatility. Her magnetism is perilous, her chaos ritualized. She replays old wounds like theater, not to heal, but to feel alive, pulling anyone near into her maelstrom. Robert Greene's The 48 Laws of Power illustrates it in history through Lola Montez. King Ludwig I clung so tightly to her that his defense of her scandals sparked riots, forcing his abdication. Franz Liszt's genius dimmed, his music faltering in her storm. Publisher James Gordon Bennett Jr. became a national punchline after shielding her, his name synonymous with folly. Each man thought himself her savior. Each was undone by her seemingly helpless, yet deeply dangerous demeanor. Today's siren traps men with relentless tactics, staged emergencies draining finances, midnight calls framed as tests of loyalty, flirtation promising intimacy that never comes. Victims sacrifice promotions to chase stability for her, lose sleep managing chaos, alienate friends defending her reputation, until their lives revolve entirely around trying to calm her storms. This goes beyond verbal and emotional manipulation. It's a neurochemical hostage situation. Cortisol and adrenaline sharpen focus in crisis, while dopamine delivers intoxicating hits from intermittent affection or drama. Trauma bonding research explains why calm feels unbearable after enough of these hot and cold cycles. Stillness feels empty because the nervous system is hooked on chaos. For her, drama isn't disruptive, it's survival fuel. When the wounded feminine has the opportunity to bond with another, The fear of being hurt again moves her to weaponize communication. Spinning, a toxic expression of the shadow feminine, clouds out reason with projection and manipulative appeals to emotion such as, "You didn't just forget. You don't care. If you love me, you'll stop making me mad. If you really cared, you'd answer my text right away. If you don't love me at my worst, you don't deserve me at my best." These appeals are often designed to make you look cold or unsympathetic for not bending to them. That's why they work so well, especially on people who think themselves good or moral. Cancel culture used this gaslighting technique very, very effectively. Millions of otherwise smart people surrendered their reasoning powers and swallowed the woke propaganda. But beneath the velvet glove of these virtue-signaling statements lies the same dark agenda used by the fascists of the mid-20th century. On the other end of this spectrum is the shadow masculine's weaponization of logic and reason as tools for self-preservation. This happens when the masculine trait of aggression expresses itself through the dark feminine. Instead of listening for the meaning and emotion behind someone's speech, she uses a verbal manipulation technique called logic chopping. This is the splintering of words and phrases to distort the meaning of the person speaking them. You. Let's not fight. Let's talk. We're on the same side. Them. What side? This isn't a competition. You. I meant we're on the same team. Them. Team? This is not a game I signed up for. You. You know what I meant. Them. Yeah, I do. You're turning this conversation into a competition. You. It was a metaphor. Them. Well, maybe you should explain yourself without using riddles. You. I was just saying that we're on the same side. Them. See? Ugh, you said sides. I'm not taking sides here. You are. Each logical detour forces endless redefinitions until meaning drowns beneath semantics. This hyper-rational style of gaslighting is often masked beneath claims of intellectual and moral superiority. The other person isn't just manipulated, they're belittled as verbally and intellectually incapable of communicating. True, words matter, and clear communication is a skill worth learning, but meanings don't lie in the definitions of words or the logical structures we frame them in. They lie within the heart of the person speaking them. When we elevate the rules of logic and grammar above the raw truths of human nature, we push everyone out of our lives who doesn't agree word for word with our perspectives. The siren is also a master of weaponizing her own dark emotions to control and influence the emotions and behaviors of others. Miss Havisham, the tragic figure from Charles Dickens' Great Expectations, embodies the wounded siren archetype. Forever seated in her decayed wedding dress, a grotesque shrine to betrayal, she remained trapped in the moment when she was abandoned at the altar. She became a living monument to grief, her slumped frame, shallow breaths, and weary sighs radiating heaviness. This haunting image helps you see how the siren clings to her pain and freezes in it, inviting others to join her mausoleum. Men see this and confuse it for depth, mistaking the siren's deliberately unhealed pain for a wound that can be healed with the sufficient amount of love. Miss Havisham's influence goes further. She weaponizes her own wound by grooming her adopted daughter, Estella, to break men's hearts as revenge for her own betrayal. This seduction ensnares Pip, the main character, whose longing for Estella blinds him to the trap set by Havisham's grief. Here we see the siren's power to lure the wounded masculine, those hungry for love, validation, or redemption, into ruin with promises they desperately want to believe. Her allure offers not intimacy, but initiation into her pain, binding him to her unresolved wound and pulling him deeper into her haunted world. This is how the siren seduces and destroys the wounded masculine, by dangling affection as bait while making her suffering the stage on which he must perform. He believes he is rescuing her or winning her daughter's love, but in truth he is being consumed by the gravity of her unhealed wound. Men lured into this trap step into self-abandoning roles like the fixer, pays debts, abandons his dreams, convinced devotion will repair her. The listener takes every call, absorbs breakdowns, believing endless patience will earn intimacy. By the time a man realizes what's happening, the cost is devastating. His finances are drained covering her emergencies. His career stalls from missed promotions while he shows up for her. His relationships with friends and family are strained from defending her. His health declines under anxiety, sleepless nights, and constant tension. He's left emotionally exhausted, financially depleted, and socially isolated. Most sirens won't change. They are trapped in their wounds and repeat the same destructive patterns, dragging down anyone who tries to help them or even get close to them. On rare occasions, a siren may wake up and choose to heal, but not often. The allure of being the center of attention, the object of praise, and the beneficiary of endless gifts is just too intoxicating. These warnings are for their victims, those who need to see clearly and protect themselves. If you recognize these signs in someone else, step back and create distance and boundaries. Sirens appear helpless, but beneath the mask lies a carefully executed agenda. They might not even be consciously aware of this, but they're dangerous nonetheless. If you recognize them in yourself and are ready to change, I commend your humility and courage. Remember that, as with your other shadow selves, your siren is your higher self in exile. Psychologist David Hawkins mapped this state in his scale of consciousness, placing grief at 75 out of 1,000, just above apathy but far below courage. Grief is emotional quicksand and shows up in your body language, shallow breaths, posture collapsed, vitality drained. You can uncover these patterns of the reckless self by asking yourself, who or what do I need to let go of? What pain or past hurt have I made a part of my identity? Where in my body do I feel this weight right now? If you're reading this and realizing that you've been lured astray by the song of a siren, this is your turning point. Resisting her song and facing the weight you've carried for her will open the space for balance to return. You will begin to steady yourself, finding clarity where there was only noise and exhaustion. Your breath will deepen. Your body will loosen from her chains. You'll feel the quiet relief of standing on solid ground after years of turbulence. From here, you'll rebuild. You'll learn to trust your instincts again, to feel safe in your own skin, and to move forward with grounded presence rather than frantic reaction. This is not about rushing into action to escape her. It's about restoring your center so that movement has meaning and direction. In this stillness, your vitality will return, not as a fleeting rush, but as a steady current you can draw on. As this steadiness anchors you in, your adventurous self will reawaken, not reckless and grasping, but wild in a way that is rooted and alive. You'll step forward differently now, slower, more deliberate, yet brimming with power. The wreckage she left behind will no longer be a weight to drag. It will become raw material for your rebirth, proof that even chaos can be forged into something that fuels your next ascent. New subheader, Recklessness and the Dark Masculine. Where the siren lures and seduces, the dark masculine invades, violates, and controls. It is a raw force stripped of reverence, a brutal inversion of the adventurous self. It is movement without meaning, conquest without compromise, and violence disguised as the duty to expand and to progress. It is the conquering energy that led to the colonization and even the annihilation of entire cultures throughout history. The reckless masculine wages war not out of self-defense but self-promotion. It confuses force with power and cloaks acts of violence in the narrative of virtue and victory. On the surface, he appears strategic, organized, and in control. But beneath this sanitized veneer lies a gurgling cesspool of conflicting impulses that cauterize the severed stump of his conscience and destroy those who dare to stand in the path of his selfish ambitions. History is drenched in blood on account of this shadow archetype. The Assyrian kings lined their city walls with impaled captives, skin flayed and stretched as banners of terror. Prisoners were dragged by hooks through their flesh, paraded like trophies. Viking berserkers, bare-chested and painted in blood, stormed coastal monasteries in trance, hacking down monks and enslaving survivors while the horizon burned. Aztec priests, crimson-painted, carved beating hearts from chests atop pyramids slick with rivers of blood. Roman arenas transformed slaughter into theater, lions tearing men, women, and children apart to appease the roaring crowds. Genghis Khan's campaigns erased entire cities, his genetic shadow etched into 1 in every 200 men alive today through mass rape. The European colonizers of North America cloaked this shadow in progress. Manifest Destiny marched families of Native Americans along the Trail of Tears, starving, freezing, and dying, all sanctified under banners of divine right. This is the dark masculine's mask, brutality baptized as the installing of civilization. Ancient texts depicted this archetype in the tragic heroes of myth and legend. Nimrod, the hunter king of Babel, defied heaven itself, his tower a monument to rebellion. Gilgamesh, self-proclaimed as a half-god, drowned his grief in slaughter. The Vedic hymns exalted Indra's storm of victories, celebrating violence as cosmic order. These stories carry a single common theme. Untethered from balance, masculine energy descends from direction into domination. The sacred masculine builds, protects, and directs. The dark masculine consumes, it subjugates, it extracts. It is not generative but parasitic, expansion stripped of purpose and restraint. It is the metaphorical Tower of Babel collapsing under its own hubris, the fire of adventure severed from reverence and left to ravage indiscriminately. Wallace Wattles named this impulse to rule over others the greatest evil. Conquest is the dark inversion of divine creativity. Hawkins's scale of consciousness maps this coiling spiral between the level of fear, calibrating at 100, hypervigilance bracing the body for perpetual fight, and desire, calibrating at 125 for compulsive expansion, devouring meaning itself. The dark feminine collapses inward into grief, 75, which it either cloaks or romanticizes under the toxic persona of the siren. The dark masculine explodes outward, destabilizing everything it touches. Anyone possessed by the reckless masculine might ask themselves, what do I worry most about losing control of? What have I pursued at the cost of what truly matters? Modern biology has mapped how this twisted relationship between fear and control shows up in the human nervous system and endocrine system. Chronic cortisol from sustained aggression depletes immunity and erodes bone. Testosterone amplifies reactivity when untethered from regulation. Dopamine habituates the need for dominance and violence, addicting the reward system to intensity rather than integration. The Bryan's hypothalamus, where aggression and sexual arousal can overlap, helps explain why violence and sexual violation so often intertwine. Modern research on conflict-driven sexual violence, Wood, 2009, shows that such acts are often less about sexual desire and more about domination, humiliation, terror, and the assertion of power. Polyvagal theory might describe this state as chronic sympathetic activation, mobilization without discharge, where the nervous system can neither fully fight nor fully rest, but remains frozen in perpetual readiness. Those possessed by these traits are not merely addicted to the impulse to rule over others. They are addicted to the biochemical surge that domination itself creates. The three traits of the dark triad describe the impulses of many of the shadow selves we've explored in this book. These three traits are Machiavellianism, strategic control or manipulation, echoing the insecure self's need to control and manage outcomes as we discussed in Chapter 5. Psychopathy, the pull toward callousness or emotional numbness linked to the reckless self's compulsive drive. This can manifest in the persona of the siren or the reckless conqueror. Narcissism, fragile grandiosity tied to the passive self, Chapter 7, and also to the manipulative self, Chapter 9, reflecting their combined craving for external validation and the control over others. This link between the dark triad traits and the shadow selves highlights how modern psychology reflects the archetypal forces described in ancient texts. Before we unpack this connection further, here are two warnings. First, the internet is infected with false information, unverified opinions, and, in many cases, straight-up misinformation about narcissism. Most content creators aren't experts on this topic or even interested in it beyond its potential to bring them attention. They use keyword research tools to discover how terms like narcissist and narcissistic abuse generate attention and engagement. They publish content on these buzzwords because they know it will attract attention, not because they understand the psychology behind it. As a result, people and behaviors are often mislabeled as narcissistic when the description simply doesn't fit. Sadly, even people with advanced degrees often allow their own trauma and desire for social media views to interfere with their commitment to teach objectively and accurately on this subject. Approach this topic with caution and discernment, recognizing that popularity online doesn't equal accuracy. Your best defense against being misled is not to focus on degrees or credentials, but to strengthen and deepen your wisdom by studying the longer-lived and more robustly refined writings found in ancient texts. Our ancestors were, in many ways, wiser on these topics than we are today, and their writings have stood the test of time and been refined across broader cultural contexts. And my second warning: if your first impulse in reading this is to diagnose people in your past or present, you're missing the heart of shadow work. These aren't clinical labels. They're lenses for not only understanding the motives of others, but for sharpening your own self-awareness. You may have felt it in your own body or noticed it in your actions. The reckless self carries a restless drive to keep moving because slowing down feels unsafe. Maybe you've pushed yourself to exhaustion, chasing the next win, only to feel empty minutes later. Or maybe conflict feels easier than calm because stillness exposes the emotions you've buried. These are the fingerprints of the dark masculine, subtle but just as consuming as the more robust expressions of this shadow portrayed in this historical figures and events. Over time, victories lose their edge. The rush fades faster. What once felt like strength starts to feel like pressure, coiled in your jaw, shoulders, and chest. Sleep fragments. Your voice sharpens with judgment and condescension. You brace for a battle that never comes, tense against a world that isn't striking you, but feels like it could at any moment. Behind this constant hypervigilance, the nervous system spirals quietly toward exhaustion and burnout. This can be delayed by self-medicating addictions to behaviors or substances, but in time, the body turns against itself in the form of complex autoimmune diseases, where the same chemicals that are meant to protect you from toxins and diseases begin to attack your healthy tissues. This is how the dark masculine traps you, mistaking urgency for vitality, control for safety, intensity for purpose. And beneath this armor is not a monster, but the shadow of a wounded boy who learned that tenderness was dangerous, and that aggression was the best path to safety and validation. He replaced compassion with the cold-blooded impulse to survive because he saw it as the only way to meet his intrinsic drive to make his life a meaningful adventure. That same fire, once untethered, now burns without direction. It rages like a brush fire, burning out of control and scorching his inner being as much as it incinerates those in its path. Seeing these traits in yourself won't weaken you. It will ground you. It's how you name what you felt but couldn't articulate, the part of you that's been running so long you've forgotten how to stand still. Ancient wisdom warned of this spiral, not to condemn you, but to remind you. Unchecked, it collapses under its own weight, like towers built too high without a foundation. This recognition is the pivot. You begin to see how what you've called discipline may be hypervigilance, how drive may be avoidance. It's not a call to abandon strength. It's an invitation to refine it, to steady the fire rather than let it consume. In this light, the dark masculine is not an enemy. It's a signal, a reminder that strength without rest, action without meaning, and conquest without reflection leave you unfulfilled. The work here is not to shame this energy, but to see it clearly enough that it can be reclaimed. Its raw power directed toward building, protecting, and creating rather than endlessly bracing. This is how the adventurous self matures, not by erasing its fire, but by tempering it with purpose, clarity, and reverence for its own limits. In naming this shadow, you loosen its grip. You stop mistaking its roar for truth and start feeling the steady pulse beneath it, guiding you back toward balance and intention. But it starts with recognizing the energy of the reckless self and the spiritual predator that feeds off of it. New subheader: Lust as the illusion of freedom. When our drive for adventure is severed from presence, we blur the lines between stability and captivity. The masculine and feminine energies become the reckless shadows of themselves, bound not by sacred devotion, but the symbiotic need to feed on the base passions of each other. Both seek power, both subject themselves and each other to possession and slavery. This compels them to flee the assumed cage of stability to pursue pleasure and excess in the name of liberation. Both represent the reckless self possessed by Asmodeus, the spiritual predator who feeds on trauma, isolation, and unhealed wounds. His drug is the sin of lust. Lust is not passion, and it's certainly not liberation. It's a double-edged sword that cuts victim and predator alike. Asmodeus set his mark on me early in life. When I was an adolescent, a deacon at my church sexually assaulted me at summer camp. When I returned home, I mustered up the courage to tell my father. My voice and hands quaked with fear, my heart burned with shame, but my recollection and my words were undeniable. When I had finished, my father paused, looked into the distance, and went on talking as though I hadn't said a word. I collapsed into the sinking feeling in my chest, like a scream drowned in fast-drying concrete. I felt unseen, unheard, and left to wrestle with an evil I had no language to name. Sunday after Sunday, I watched that man lift his hands to worship my Jesus with hymns of joy, while I sat in shameful silence. The bile of rage and resentment swirled in me like a poison. This is how Asmodeus strikes. First comes the attack, then shame, then isolation, as the victim struggles to reconcile the injustice. This is the dwelling place of demons spoken of in chapter 3. It's the inner vacuum where disowned pain festers, creating a breeding ground for parasitic thought forms which the ancients called demons. This is how victims of lust become vulnerable to possession by their own base impulses. As a victim, I learned to mask my pain with pleasure at times and performance at others. I cut myself into pieces, hoping no one would ever notice. I damned myself to hell, not because I had been judged and rejected by God, but because I had rejected the part of me of which I'd become ashamed. Isolated from the light and warmth of God's love and the comfort of others, I clung to Asmodeus like an orphaned child longing for the breast of its mother. Soon after, I began reaching for the drug that Asmodeus offered as medication for my spiritual and emotional wounds. This connection between isolation and the possession of the demon of lust is not a religious idea. Dr. John Cacioppo's research at the University of Chicago shows that social rejection activates the same brain pathways as physical injury. Loneliness isn't just emotional, it rewires the brain, shrinking regions tied to empathy while amplifying fear. When I buried my trauma, I didn't just forget, it changed me. I became a stranger to myself, and so I reached for what the world said would soothe, chronic masturbation and porn, but porn didn't comfort me, it colonized me. Each click became a ritual of numbness, a private surrender to Asmodeus. I didn't know his name, but I knew his shadow, offering pleasure with no intimacy, release with no connection. Like Jung's autonomous complexes, these repeated actions carved neural grooves in my brain. The Max Planck Institute's 2014 study confirmed that chronic porn use shrinks gray matter in the prefrontal cortex, damaging our ability to feel joy, regulate behavior, and form lasting bonds. The notoriously brutal serial killer Ted Bundy understood this. In his final interview, hours before his execution, he warned that porn was the gateway drug to his depravity, saying, "Without exception, every violent man I've met was deeply involved with porn." That wasn't an excuse or the rantings of an erratic madman. It was a confession of a man who had become consumed by the impulses he had once fed on. Decades after my own sexual trauma, during one of the most powerful church services in my time as a minister, I later learned that during that service, a young man who was married to the pastor's daughter had broken into his lover's house, raped, strangled, and murdered her. The next week, our pastor addressed the youth congregation with the brutal truth about what had led him down such a dark path, saying, "This was not a man my niece met on the streets. She met him in Bible college, where they were preparing to go into full-time ministry together. About a year ago, he started watching porn. Then he became addicted. That's when the affair started, and that was the beginning of the end for them, and for this young woman he killed. If I could only tell you one thing tonight, it would be to stay away from pornography. It's evil." I counseled his niece and her 2 young boys through the next year as their father sat on death row. I learned that, in an attempt to satisfy his growing lust, she would have sex with him until both of their genitals were raw and bleeding. She had done this hoping it would be enough to satisfy her husband's lust, but Asmodeus will never be satisfied in such ways because it's not sex he wants. He wants to divide the 2 sacred energies that, when combined, create the most divine and powerful creative force in the universe. This fracturing and divorce of the sacred masculine and feminine gives rise to the dark feminine siren and the reckless conqueror of the dark masculine. Longing for the connection that can only come from their divine union, they cling to each other, not in godly union, but in codependent bondage. This is how lust goes beyond a personal vice and becomes the spiritual disease that corrupts and devours nations. This is hell. It's not just about being alone and separated from God and from others. It's about being alone in what you've suffered, isolated from those who could comfort and support you, and severed in shame from your authentic self. Just as the monster Larry in chapter 3 was summoned by isolation, feeding on the boy's loneliness until it broke the veil between worlds, so too does lust invade the soul of the spiritually disconnected. Larry wasn't evil in the traditional sense. He was lonely. He was exiled. He was the embodiment of unmet longing. But his isolation twisted his desire. In his desperation for connection, he became a parasite, feeding on the very thing he lacked. He entered through the boy's tablet screen, growing stronger with every glance, every ounce of attention. Like so many digital predators in our own world, he didn't break in through the front door, he crawled through the silence. The boy's pain was the portal, and so it is with us. Unspoken pain becomes the playground for predators. Every viral trend, every click, every echo of our digital isolation feeds something. and the monster grows. We allow this to happen because it comes in the subtle creep of millions and millions of decisions made in isolation. Lust doesn't walk in and announce itself. It doesn't need to. It whispers. It offers comfort. But it arrives only after presence has left. It hides in what we call freedom, guarding the chains we refuse to see. Confront a man on his addiction and he'll often lash out, not because it's untrue, but because it threatens the very scaffolding of his identity. This is how Asmodeus works. He masks captivity as choice and possession as pleasure and freedom. Ezekiel 23 paints a grim picture of two sisters, Oholah and Oholibah, symbols of Israel and Judah, whose lust led them to betray their covenant. She lusted for her lovers, whose genitals were like those of donkeys, and whose emission was like that of horses. Ezekiel 23:20 NKJV. This isn't just prudish poetry found in an outdated religious book. It's a warning to ancient and modern people alike. It warns us that lust enslaves. It strips the sacred from our bodies and mocks what's holy. And in Revelation 18, the fall of Babylon is marked by these chilling words. The merchants of the earth will weep and mourn over her, for no one buys their merchandise anymore, and the bodies and souls of men. Revelation 18:11-13 NKJ5. This tells us that Babylon, the worldwide network of modern secular governments, traffics not only in goods, but in souls. This speaks of the porn and the human trafficking industry, selling of human flesh and shattered spirits in exchange for attention and money. Book 20 of the Dhammapada warns of this personal poison as the root of wider spread corruption. Cut down the forest, lust, but not the tree. From the forest springs fear. For so long as the underbrush of desire, even the most subtle of a man towards a woman, is not cut down, his mind is in bondage. In chapter 12 of the Tao Te Ching, Lao Tzu wrote of the dangers of overstimulation. 5 or more colors blind the eye, 5 or more tones deafen the ear, 5 or more flavors dull the taste. Excessive indulgence leads to confusion of the mind. This speaks of how the overindulgence of physical desires numbs our senses, leading to the constant drive for more stimulation and the eventual confusion and corruption of the mind. What was true for mystics 2,000 years ago remains true for us. Overstimulated senses lead to spiritual amnesia. I've lived that amnesia. I know the cold flicker of a screen in a dark room, the counterfeit comfort of pixels that promise connection but leave you emptier than before. I've wept for the part of me that longed to be seen and instead was sold, and I felt the rage of watching the man who hurt me sing to the God who I was begging for help. But here's the truth Babylon hides. Every act of resistance is a declaration of war. Every confession, every tear, every honest confrontation with buried pain breaks the spell. Healing felt like hell, like fire licking the walls of my false self, but it was also the first breath of heaven. Porn isn't about sex or entertainment. Lust isn't about desire. Both are symptoms of exile. They scream that your soul is starving for love and connection. Pornography is the literal worship of the spiritual predator Asmodeus. Sadly, it's also a common vice for men in the modern church, including pastors and leaders who claim that Jesus is their true Lord. This is one of many reasons the modern church is failing in its mission to fulfill Jesus' final command to make disciples of all nations. Meanwhile, the New Age and alternative spirituality movement is recruiting women at record numbers, many of whom are wondering where all the spiritually awakened and healthy masculine men are. Many of them are entangled in the worship of Asmodeus, while paying lip service to the gospel of Jesus Christ. I know this will piss a lot of people off, so be it. The truth will set you free, but first it will humble you. Until the men of the world face this and stop numbing themselves and seek the healing of this shadow self, they will continue in bondage, and the spiritually awake women will be forced to carry the torch for both the sacred feminine and masculine, a role which neither sex was ever mean to bear alone. Escaping this addiction starts with seeing the one thing that Asmodeus hopes the masculine and the feminine will never understand or accept, that a man's sexual desire and hunger for conquest are not evil in themselves, that a woman's longing for admiration, influence, and even power is not toxic. Both are sacred fires. When cast into shadow, they devour us from within, creating a haunting place for demons and a breeding ground for the sin of lust. When brought into the light and reclaimed in their divine union, they will burn the kingdom of Asmodeus to ash and clear the path back to Eden.
End of Chapter 6, Part 2 of Awaken Your Shadow by Seth Cherapak.